Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor-Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
And me, Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
This recording takes place online with safe physical distancing. Our featured guests this episode are André Narbonne and Marty Gervais. About our guests, André Narbonne is a lecturer in English literature and an award-winning poet and fiction writer. He's the fiction editor of the Windsor Review. Marty Gervais is a publisher, poet, developer of the Publishing Practicum course at the University of Windsor, and Poet Laureate Emeritus of the City of Windsor. He was a longtime editor for the Windsor Review. So welcome, everybody.
Welcome. Hello. Thank you for having us.
Hello. Thank you.
So this is an unusual recording session for us, as we usually interview one or two writers at a time and focus on, their work or their latest work. But this time we're celebrating a collaboration, a collaborative achievement of 50 years of publication of the Windsor Review. Either Marty or Andre, would you be able to give us a quick history of your perspective, from your perspective of the review?
Sure. If you don't mind, I'll do that, and Marty can correct any errors that I make. I came to the review quite late, I should say. I started in 2014. I took over the fiction editorship at that time. And when I did, I got the whole history of the review. I got the whole collection, about 93, give or take, issues. And I started reading. And the Windsor Review is one of the great success stories of this city, I would say. One of the great literary success stories. It started in 1965. It was Eugene McNamara's baby. It started at a time of real Canadianism, a time when the zeitgeist or the interest was in the centennial year. And Eugene McNamara started up this journal that was eclectic. It was a journal that was continental. It was not participating really in the Confederation buzz. And normally I would say, and Marty can correct me, that a journal doesn't survive its first general editor. And if it does, it doesn't survive 20 years. And if it does, it doesn't survive 40 years. The Windsor Review has been here for more than 50. So what Eugene started with this eclectic journal, with a multidisciplinary journal that, by the way, did not have any creative writing the first 2 years. None. It started off as a review of culture. So what he started has kept going, and it's been important. It's been vital. It wasn't something that grew out of a long tradition. It was something that started a tradition.
Marty, would you like to add to that?
Well, I think its importance is in the longevity of the magazine. I mean, it's been around for 50 years because I think it matters. I think it's important. I think literary magazines are important. I think I think what Gene McNamara had as a vision was to highlight, to publish new and innovative authors. And and when I was asked to take over the editing of the magazine, it was Catherine Quincy, who was the head of the Department of English, who asked if I would do that. I was a little taken aback because the magazine was in some ways where I really got my start in writing. I was in Toronto, and I was writing and sending out my work to magazines all over the country. And I sent, what it was I'd gone down to Marty Alvanus's The Village Bookstore, which was on Gerrard Street at that time, where the Chelsea Hotel is today. And I walked in there and I found a copy of the Windsor Review, and it caught my attention because I was born in Windsor and I lived here till I was about the age of 12. But so it caught my attention, and I at the time I couldn't afford to I wasn't working, and so I didn't have any money to buy the review, but I stood there and read it in the bookstore. And I made note of the address, and I sent poems. And that's how I got introduced to Eugene McNamara. I mean, I had met him, but I came down here in 1968, and one of the first people that I sought out was Eugene McNamara, and I met him in the English department. I went up there, I sought him out, and we went out for a beer. We talked, and he published some of my first poems. And so being asked to take over the magazine was, it was such an honor. I was a little taken aback, as I say, because it was a magazine that I had always looked at, sort of from a distance, because it was being edited by people who really knew literature, Eugene McNamara being one of them, John Ditsky, great poet and great professor, and then later on Alistair MacLeod. So when I took over the magazine, Alistair was still editing the fiction and John Ditsky was still editing the poetry. So these two giants on either side of me, it was quite an amazing experience.
The editors tended to stay for quite a long time. I was only the third fiction editor, and I have given that role up now. Holly Adams has come into that position. I'm moving to reviews. So we're going to be a review journal again.
Ah.
So Marty, early contributors included Marshall McLuhan and Joyce Carol Oates. All kinds of award-winning writers were published in the Windsor Review. I think the review contributed to the landscape of Canadian creative works at the time.
Mm-hmm. I think that Eugene McNamara was reaching out to all sorts of people. I mean, the University of Windsor itself, or Assumption, had so many luminaries, coming here and working here, and I think McNamara was, like people, like others before him at Assumption, were reaching out, to bring interest and prestige and importance to the magazine, and that's why, when I look back and I see that Marshall McLuhan was published in this magazine, it's mind you, there are people today there are students at the University of Windsor who have no idea who Marshall McLuhan is, but I know it's surprising and shocking, but it's true.
It's tragic.
I know it's tragic, exactly. But yeah.
Well, Andre, as the fiction editor who led the 50th anniversary issue, you had kind of a mammoth task. How did you approach deciding what works to include?
Yeah, good question. Well, that was fraught with peril, to be honest. In doing this, I think I had 43 writers that I picked out of 1,000. So that's inclined to make a lot of enemies.
Yeah.
I needed some clear direction. I needed some idea of what I was about. And what I wanted to do was highlight the role of the editor in the creation of the Windsor Review. So what I did was I tried to get at Eugene's canon. Who were canonical to him? Who was he bringing in? And who would he put in? Who would a 30-year-old Eugene McNamara put into this issue? That's what I tried to get at. So, I mean, some of the choices were really quite easy. And some of them are, just to go back to the trouble of this, the peril of it, the external examiner of my PhD published 3 times in the Windsor Review, and I did not put him in the 50th anniversary issue. So that's what I was looking at. When I looked at it, I thought, okay, what is his canon? How does this represent this year? And I was specifically interested in the first 20 years, I would say, and then in making my choices, I had the help of other editors. I went to Susan Holbrook, who was a long-serving poetry editor, and I asked her to give me to include an article on one of the issues that she had edited, and to pick 3 writers from that. I asked Marty to pick 3 authors who he thought were very important to the journal, and so it was collaborative in that sense too. And I asked Marty for an essay about his contribution.
So what kind of insights did you draw from that intense study of the first 20 years? What do you think that canon was all about? How would you describe it?
Well, the surprise to me was just what an international journal this was from the start. This is one of the issues early on where half of the authors are American. Pushcart Award winners, there are, you name it, major award winners from Canada and from the United States. And sometimes the articles, the critical articles, are directed absolutely towards an American audience. They say, here in the US, we must think this way. So that was a surprise to me, because I rather assumed that after Klink's massive tome on Canadian literature, which came out in '65, and all of this interest in the centennial, that the journals would be shaped that way. I mean, the journals that I really knew, journals like the Fiddlehead, had a very local Canadian idea. The Fiddlehead was based on a tradition. It started with the Confederation poets, so Bliss Carman, Charles G.D. Roberts. They could dip in and say, here's where we come from, here's why we matter now. And something like the Fiddlehead, just as an example, could serve as a platform for bringing modernism to New Brunswick, or showing what a New Brunswick modernism looked like. Eugene's journal doesn't do that. And like I say, it's eclectic. And when you look at something that's eclectic, you might say, okay, well, that's not a direction, but I would say that eclecticism is a direction. And this is what he was trying to do, was trying to promote, trying to foster a Windsor School of Writing that, perhaps not a school, but a Windsor community that would be international in its scope. So I hadn't expected that. I had expected that I was going to read a lot of sort of gather around the Cambrian shield sort of stuff. But what I got instead was stuff that didn't really notice that. Or if it did it in a way that was directed towards a cosmopolitan audience.
Let's talk a little bit about Dr. Eugene McNamara's involvement a bit more. What was it about his, I think you've touched on it, but we can focus with both of you. What was about his approach to work on the journal that gave it such longevity, do you think? Like, why did it stick? Why did this Americanism and this biculturalism, or even multiculturalism, how did it stick?
People liked Eugene. That's the answer, I think. I mean, I was in his the special collections at Master University, and I was looking through his letters. I was trying to get as much information as I could, because Eugene didn't leave a record. He didn't have these polemics in the journal, and he didn't publish in it. He didn't publish in it until he retired. He wanted this to be for other writers. So I was reading his letters, and he had a long reach. Irving Layton was quite a fan, for instance. So, and that's what did it. I mean, you set a groundwork like that, and people just want to continue.
Yeah, he was,
sorry.
If I could jump in, he was a very open, generous soul. And even though he had his own particular style of writing, he was so open to other styles and other traditions, and he was a very, as I say, very open-hearted individual who liked to be challenged, at times, but he was also interested in finding new writers and encouraging them. And I was one of those young writers, and when I showed up, I was already being published, but I needed to meet this person, and I needed to see what the Windsor Review was all about when I came here in 1968. And what I found was a very open-hearted, generous individual who was genuinely interested in what I had to say about writing and what I was doing and what I was working on. And it's one of the first things he asked me, what are you working on? And no one had really asked me that. No one had taken my writing seriously enough to think that they could ask a question like that. Because at that point in time, if someone asked me what I was working on, I would have probably translated that into, what job do I have right now? Am I working as a dishwasher? Am I working in a library? What am I doing?
Let's face it too, he was lucky. He could look out his office door and see people walking by who were going to be major writing figures in Canada and the United States. And he could pull them into his offices and say, hey, look what I'm doing. Do you want to be involved? And his editors were brilliant. So he had that pull.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
So how influential was Alistair MacLeod's contribution as fiction editor?
That's for you, Marty.
I think it was enormous. I mean, he was. I think he could identify a good story when he heard it, and when he saw it. And Alistair, his whole approach, it was so different from John Ditzky as a poetry editor. And I say that in the journal, where I'm not really digressing when I'm saying this, but John Ditzky, his office was right next to mine. And John Ditzky was a person of very few words, and he would step out of his office and he would hand me a sheaf of poems, almost as if he was handing back, my exam, and saying, "There they are. There was no discussion about it. These are the ones you're going to publish." And Alistair, on the other hand, would come by my office, and he would, very politely, pop in and say, "Are you busy?" And I'd say, "No." And he'd sit down and he'd have maybe one or two stories in his hands, or maybe three stories, and he would say, "Well, these two you can send back. This one, this is an interesting story." And he would talk about the story. And he was wavering a little bit, but he would, and sometimes he would even actually read a paragraph from the story, something that he was really excited about. And so it was more of I don't know, I think maybe it was collaborative in that sense. And maybe looking, for my reaction, possibly. I'm not sure. But it was always so interesting. And of course, if he came to your office, he was there for an hour. It was never like a 5-minute visit. And it would lead to other things. We talk about, the Red Wings, and we talk about the politics, and we talk about writing and different writers, but we talk about all sorts of things. But initially, it was the story itself, and he would get caught up in the story, and what charmed him about the story, and I think in a crazy kind of way, we would come to an agreement, and it would get published. And that's how he worked with me. And it's not the kind of editorial board where people sit around the table and provide judgment on whether we should publish this person or that person. It was, in Alistair's case, it was a conversation, and it was chatting, and in between talking about the story, he would and making a decision, there would be other subjects that would roll in and roll out, and that's the way it was done. But his influence, I think he kept it to himself. He would talk about writers, and he would talk about how he had seen a particular story or a poem, or heard something on the radio, or saw something, a discussion or something in the Globe and Mail, for example, and he would talk about writers, but talking about the writing, not wasn't gossip. It was talking about the craft, and how he was charmed by it, how he was curious about it, and that was it was always interesting. We were laughing the other day here at home, because I remember when it was, I remember him popping in my office, and he always had a joke, and of course with May the 4th having just passed, he would come in and say, May the 4th be with you, and it was kind of corny, but that was Alistair, and but yeah, great influence.
Well, sounds exactly like him.
I met Alistair through the review. When I first came to the university, I was working contract to contract. He was a very famous writer, very much admired, and I didn't want to talk to him because I was shy. And I thought he's going to be just like very important, somebody that I can only screw up talking to. But I had written a really good story, and I thought that might be an introduction, a way to talk to him. I had written what I still consider to be my best story, and I submitted it to the Windsor Review, thinking that if it passed muster, he would read it, and then he would know who I was, and maybe we'd have a conversation. And the story it ends with a mother saying to her son, who's having an affair with a woman in Newfoundland, "Never mind your father, he's in paradise," meaning Paradise, Newfoundland. And the first time Alistair ever spoke to me, he poked his head in my door, pointed a finger at me and said, "I'll see you in paradise." And after that, we were friends.
That's good. That sounds so much like Alistair too. So, yeah.
This is for anybody who wants to weigh in on this question. What is it about Windsor, sort of a blue-collar town with a university and a border city region, that kind of contributed to the collaborative success that the Windsor Review became? Or what is it that surprises you about it happening here?
Well, let me go back to something Andre mentioned. He used the word cosmopolitan, and he's absolutely right. There wasn't anything. I don't think there was anything about the review, like Fiddlehead and so many other magazines that existed, and publishing companies for that matter, that have a school, a school of thought or a school of writing, a certain kind of writing, and I think what Windsor is like that. I think if you look at the writing community, the writing community is so diverse, and you have writers who are engaging in some wonderful experimental writing, and you have other writers who are writing more documentary or traditional stories and poems, and I think we are cosmopolitan, and I think a lot of it has to do with maybe living on the riverfront, on the border, possibly. But I think it's good. I mean, I think it's and I think the review kind of grew out of that. And I think the review in some ways just reflects what's actually happening in the literary community. And maybe that's why it survived. And so many writers come here to Windsor, and they're so, some of them are so surprised to find this literary community existing here. I don't know why they're surprised, and because our literary community goes back a long, long way. I mean, here the review itself is 50 years old. Black Moss Press is 50 years old. We've been doing important literary activities and publishing important people, for half a century. And I don't know whether you can look at other communities the same way. That's the way I'm going to weigh in on it. But I think Windsor is a very special place, and that's why I gravitated to it. That's why I like being here. I think it's rich in culture, and being on the border, I think we get to look at the world a little bit differently, and that sets us apart, and that makes us special. So, I don't know, what do you think, Andre? Because I really think that the review reflects the writing community in Windsor, and
it reflects. I think I've given this a lot of thought, and I don't know as much about the city as you do, and I don't know anyone who does. So I'm not going to.
All right.
In opposition to what you've said, But for me, it's a reflection of the relationship of the university to the city itself, to a working class city, cosmopolitan, but a sort of muted cosmopolitanism that you find in a working class city. But it's academia on the street.
Mm-hmm.
So, Andre, where do you think the Windsor Review goes from here?
I don't know. I really don't. I think it's in really great hands. Dale Jacobs has taken over the editorship, and the future looks bright. I don't know where writing goes now. The American journals are now often charging people just a reading fee to be read. So I don't know that the journal will end up being the proving ground it used to be. And here's my pessimism, and I know that Marty doesn't share this, but this was the thing. Like with Marty, as it was with Marty, it was with me. I walked into a magazine store when I was in high school, and I picked up a copy of The Fiddlehead. I keep referencing this, but it was The Fiddlehead. And I thought, okay, I want to do that. I want to talk to this audience. I want to talk in this way. And at 17, I was on the path to becoming a writer because I was reading the journals. It took me a few years to get into them, but I don't know what happens next. I know that if we continue to publish quality, that people will continue to be interested, and that this community the community for me is the important part. The history matters, and I was really very much interested in that, and I threw 5 years into this project because I believe in the history of it. But it's the community, it's the ability to gather people together. And in a journal, you have people gathered who will never meet, but they're somehow participants in this community. When they identify with it, they put on their resumes, they put on their CVs, published in the Windsor Review. And you see that in another publication, and you say, okay, we're there. We're a part of this too. But I guess ask Marty, and you'll get a more positive response.
Well, I mean, I don't know what to say. Earlier I said a literary magazine is important, and that's, I think, like Andre, a person picks up a magazine and they look at what's being written, and they're curious about it, they're inspired by it, and I think what's happened with the Windsor Review is that we've provided that for 50 years. I think the direction that it's going in is good. I mean, I think that we need to be an online magazine. We need to read it online. I think it's always great to have, a fresh perspective, and I see good things for the magazine. But again, I think what it is that in Andre's case, you saw a magazine, you were curious about it, you were interested in it, you wanted to do this, and that's the way I kind of look at how important literary journals are. Is that you look at them it brings you up to date on what's being done in literature, and if you're serious about the craft and you're serious about the art, you ought to pay attention to what's being tried, what's being written about, what the subjects are, what the genres are. Not that you should follow or try to copy these, but you should be aware, you should be conscious of the movements, the trends, and you should ask yourself where you fit in. What's your signature style? And ask yourself, what sets you apart or what makes your work unique. And I think it's good to have, if you're serious about your craft, you're going to look at magazines. And I think the role of the Windsor Review will be to reflect partially the kind of community that we have, but also to reflect, the different, the kinds of literature that exist today. And I think previous editors, Eugene, cast out the net to get a certain kinds of writers, new writers, writers that were making an impact, in the writing scene. In my case, I looked to people that would do the same thing. I reached out to James Rainey, for example, a well-known Canadian writer, but I also published some of his drawings and some of his watercolors. I reached out to, Phil Hall had already been published in the magazine, but I reached out to Phil Hall and to so many other writers. Bruce Meyer, for example, reached out to him. And the idea from my point of view as an editor was to show their writing to the rest of the world, to inform the world that these people were doing something pretty special. This was interesting, fascinating literature that was making a difference and it was important. And I think the future of the magazine is I think is in good hands. I think that's where it's going to go. It's going to continue this tradition. And
really good hands, I think, with Dale. I think Dale's going to bring something that we haven't seen yet, as all editors do. Yeah. Every time that the Windsor Review got a new editor, it changed. It didn't change a lot, but it changed a bit. I think maybe this isn't helpful, maybe it is, I don't know, but I was thinking of sort of a franchise like James Bond, and you imagine Eugene being the first James Bond with all that poise, this tough guy sort of, this character who does this, and then everyone else as a new sort of comes in and does something different. Wanda Campbell came in and she moved it towards interviews, for instance. She brought that into it, and the reviews were discontinued. So you didn't have that aesthetic, you didn't have that formal sort of thing that you get with a review. You had instead conversations. So I think of her as the James Bond who focused on dialogue. And Marty is the James Bond who focuses on experiment and cinematography. But still this story, still this journal.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. Well, as the Doctor Who fan, I totally get that analogy as well. That's awesome. Well, thank you to both of you for your generous gift of time and memories. And just to say that our show notes will include a link to the online version of the 50th anniversary edition. And thank you both again for sharing so generously.
Can I add one more thing too?
Absolutely.
All right. When Andre was working on this project, I had stepped away from being the editor of the magazine, but I promised I would help him out a little bit. And but what was really interesting from a personal point of view was that Andre did such a meticulous job of finding the writers and constantly harassing me, for addresses and contacts, but it was really good because it sort of brought me back to a familiarity I had with many of the writers who appear in this particular edition, and the friendships that grew up, because of my involvement in it and my involvement with these writers. So it was it was a look back. I enjoyed the journey, and it was illuminating. And also, he found material in the archives that I had completely forgotten about, including a letter that I had written to Eugene McNamara. I was fairly snarky in my letter, as I recall. And, I don't know, demanding, when my poem would be published or whatever. I can't imagine myself being like that. I don't see myself being like that, but there it is. And the letter is in McMaster University archives.
I just want to say I'm glad that our friendship has survived this, because working on this, the only time I really spoke to people about it was when I had a problem. So if I walked into your office, I had a problem. So yeah. I'm glad that you were so helpful.
Yeah. It was fun though. It was fun becoming reacquainted with, like Joyce Carol Oates, for example, and writing to her, and that was I felt gratified in the process. So
great, thank you for that, and thank you again.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.